You know, back when I was in the academy, we would follow every toast with a song.
Hi everyone, welcome to Where No Bubs Has Gone Before, a Star Trek The Next Generation podcast hosted by myself, Jay Reckward, and my father, Jake Reckward. We're doing this for the benefit of my son Ben, but we know there's so many great Star Trek fans out there, we're releasing all of these episodes for free on YouTube. How are you doing tonight, Jake?
I'm doing well, Jay. How about you?
I'm doing pretty well. We're reviewing a fun episode tonight. We're looking at Menage Troi, which is Season 3, Episode 24, which debuted on May 28th, 1990, with a star date of 43930.7. And, I think this is just a fun episode. I don't think that we're going to have any real in-depth discussion about
No,
anything
no,
science fiction-wise. I
no.
do think that we're going to talk a lot about the culture of Star Trek and some of the things we see depicted in here. But, just in terms of the narrative in general, a nice kind of like a little romp, a nice little romp.
Well, it's sort of like the last episode, Sarek. We went into depth more about Vulcan culture and Vulcan psychology and Vulcan telepathy, and this one kind of delves into I'll say the madness of the Ferengi.
I think it.
And the way I say that, it just seems like they have a very chaotic social structure and so forth.
So let's start there a little bit. So let's dig into the narrative and see how the Ferengi get here. So there's a
Sure.
trade conference on Beta Z, and for the first time, the Ferengi have been invited, including among them Damon Togg. The captain's log actually opens with Captain's Log Stardate 43930.7. The Enterprise has been in attendance at the Biennial Trade Agreements Conference on Beta Z. For the first time, the Ferengi are present, and Picard says he has reluctantly consented to their boarding the Enterprise for the closing reception. The scene actually opens with Commander Riker playing a version of three-dimensional chess against the Ferengi Nabor in 10 Forward, as Algolian musicians play ceremonial rhythms on these kind of chime instruments I found very interesting. But he beats the Ferengi comfortably. But leading into this scene, Lwaxana Troi is present, who is, of course, the daughter. I think the daughter of the fifth house of Beta Z, the holder of the sacred chalice of Rix. I think I'm getting that right.
Right, all of
And
her
she is
titles.
there
Yeah.
as a special delegate of the Betazoids. Well, Damon Togg immediately sees her, and not only is he profoundly interested in her telepathic abilities, he also finds her quote unquote exotic, much to the initial skepticism of Dr. Ferrick, who is played, as it should be mentioned, by Ethan Phillips, who will go on to play Neelix on Star Trek Voyager. But they have this very kind of crude interaction where Togg offers to buy Lwaxana, and she kind of storms out in a huff, being insulted by the idea that the only person really attracted to her is a kind of crude Ferengi male. After she has, a very in-depth conversation with Deanna about age and kind of her expectations for Deanna, and basically pushing Deanna Troi to the idea of like, hey, I'm getting old. It's time for you to have kids.
Well,
Um,
and that conversation was interesting because it sort of fleshed out further the relationship between Deanna and her mother.
Very much so. The background between those two is that Lwaxana Troi, I think Deanna's father was either her second husband, first or second husband, because she's had multiple husbands at this point. But she had Deanna with a human, and Deanna has only produced empathic abilities because of this coupling. While it seems like she can communicate with Deanna can communicate with other Betazoids. I'm sorry, even though and I want to get his name correct. He's the Betazoid ambassador. Oh, Wretched Grax. Um, it seems as though among like full-fledged Betazoids, like Wretched Grax and Loxana Troi, they have the ability to use their telepathy to read the minds of other people in the room, except the Ferengi, and we'll get to that. But Deanna and her mother can communicate telepathically with each other, even though Deanna tries to kind of scold her mother into talking like the rest of the non-telepathic races around her. I do find this kind of a very interesting thing that I wanted to delve into a little bit tonight. As I was preparing for the episode and setting up the link and everything, I just kind of kept thinking back to this. If you had a race or a civilization of people made up of telepaths, I think it would be very interesting to see how their society develops, not only on like a macro level, but on an individual level. Because if you look at their personalities, Deanna Troy can only really sense people's emotions. So she has a good grasp of her own because there is a certain barrier versus her mother or Rachel Grax, who can read people's thoughts kind of out loud, as one would open a book. I think you would develop into a very interesting person of morals and ethics if you had the ability to read everyone's thoughts. And it seems like, when you're Loxana Troy, it kind of develops into this person who is both at one hand incredibly confident in herself because she knows what everyone's thinking, even though she's definitely insecure about her age and just the ticking of time. But you also have, for the first time, Rayton Grax is the first Betazoid that we've seen other than Luxana. And for the most part, he seems fairly stable and, very friendly, all things considered. I what I'm getting around to is, do you think if we had dealings with a race of telepaths in a larger congress of or a larger federation of planets, thinking about how many different cultures and different viewpoints you run into, especially if you're an ambassador, do you think that these people would be able to like keep sane, or they would have to deal with certain I would think telepathy would add almost a burden to a certain extent.
Well, what was the episode a couple back about the Betazoid that had extreme
Oh,
powers?
Tin
What was
Man.
Tin,
Correct.
Tin Man? So
Tam Elbrun.
yeah, I mean it. I'm thinking back to the original Star Trek pilot with the Telosians when they captured Captain Pike.
Right.
And that first introduction to Star Trek sort of introduced telepathy of a species and so forth.
Hmm.
Um, and I think that if people can communicate that way, non-verbally and just through the energy, whatever it is of thought, that's a big conflict between those species that can do it, can communicate telepathically, and read what a non-telepath is thinking. It makes the communication sort of unfair and difficult, and I think it would be a problem.
Well, on one hand, and Riker will call There's a episode later in season 4 where Deanna temporarily loses her powers, and
Mm-hmm.
Riker calls her out on like, you've always had the ability to use your your empathic abilities to like to secure yourself in the situation. You know how everyone is thinking and feeling, so you're able to react to everyone. Well, now you can't because you can't read any of us. Um, One thing that you did remind me of, and thank you for bringing up Tam Elburn from the Tin Man episode a few episodes back. Um, Tam Elburn, you're right, was struck with his telepathy from the moment he was a baby, so he developed the way he did because of this constant pressure that he's dealing with mentally and psychologically. I think they established that most Betazoids don't develop their telepathy until they're in their
In their team,
teens,
right?
which means they have a little bit of acculturation and a little bit of emotional maturity to at least handle what's going on. It's interesting that it's in its teens, so it would be like puberty. Um, but I think to a certain extent, and we never see it with Betazoid culture, but I bet you they're very careful about who they actually send to meet certain people. Like, they probably picked Rayton Grax out of a lot of people in Bayzed because they're like, okay, we can send him to the humans because we know the humans will behave, and he likes the Ferengi, so we can set him in front of the Ferengi, and everyone's going to be okay. Even though there is a scene there in Ten Forward when Data starts talking, and Rayton Grax is very uncomfortable with Data talking because he can't read Data. So, it's a very interesting interplay, I think, when it comes to telepathy, and I think how it would really work in the real world if we had to deal with it.
Yeah, I think that there'd have to be some almost some ethics and rules. If
Right.
you're dealing with your own species, like beta Zeds who have betazoids that have different degrees of telepathy, perhaps, but they're all able to communicate in that way. Again, going back, so there just wouldn't be kind of an unfairness in communication with non-telepathic species, particularly in an ambassador. They'd have to follow some rules and some ethics to make everything work.
One thing that I did find interesting is that when Deanna and Luxana are first having their kind of debate about Deanna's future, Deanna keeps trying to make Luxana speak verbally. I wonder if there is some sort of, I don't know, break that if a Betazoid is verbalizing, somehow they're not able to access their telepathic abilities.
Good question.
Or
Yeah.
I wonder if there's from a biological perspective, is their telepathy always on, or do they have the ability to kind of turn it on and turn it off, kind of like a ESP?
Well, I guess we get into how their brain would be wired differently because they have a
Yes.
different sensory structure with the telepathy, and just like one of the things that's made common is that the way the Ferengi brain is structured, the Beta Zeds cannot read Ferengi minds.
Okay, let's actually touch on the Ferengi real quick and how they're structured. So, this is the first episode that will introduce the Ferengi ears as not only being highly capable of hearing, but it's also their erogenous zone in
Mm-hmm.
a way, leading to a cultural practice they have called umox, which is
Mm-hmm.
almost kind of like a manual manipulation of a sex act for them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And even the show Menage a Troi is a play on words for
Right.
Menage a Trois, which is the
Right.
French term for a
Threesomes.
three-way sexual. Yes,
Yeah.
threesomes. Thank you, Dad. Hi, Ben. Anyway, um, so I find it interesting that the Ferengi head, they have these very small bodies, but they've evolved to have these very large ears with these very large craniums. And while they cannot be telepathically read, um, I do think that I'm surprised that this species has survived so long in the universe because, erogenous zones are not only sensitive because they're sexual organs, but like if you kick a person in the dick, or if you hit someone in the vagina, like that really hurts because of the amount of nerve endings that are present there. I know in Deep Space Nine that Quark and the other Ferengi have very very sensitive hearing that they can hear things far out of the range of human hearing or other non-Ferengi hearing. But the thing I'm trying to get to is, don't you think that the exposure of the ears is kind of a genetic flaw in a way? Like, the ears would either have to be made of something harder or something sturdier, and it just doesn't seem like they seem very delicate.
Yeah, I mean, not so much a genetic flaw because the their body
Not for
structure.
their world, not for their world, but like in going and being a spacefaring
Oh yeah,
civilization.
I think for a spacefaring, it probably could present some disadvantages, as you're saying. The ear adaptation. It would be interesting to know what the environmental conditions were on the Ferengi homeworld that caused them to evolve in that way. Very similar
Hmm.
to Darwin's finches, where those finches that live on an island and have large nuts to eat, they have very thick bills that can crush a nut, open a nut to get to the seeds, where you have on another island where the food of the finches are insects, they'll have a very pointed beak so they can go
Hmm.
to an insect nest and so on and get their food that way.
Right. And it's interesting that their ears overdeveloped because, like, the rest of their organs and their peripheral limbs did not overdevelop or underdevelop in accordance to anything else. Like, they're not blind, it seems,
No,
or
no,
particularly unable to. They're not. It seemed we're past the point where, like, from season one, where the Ferengi were physically weaker. It seems at least to a point now where, like, the Ferengi can at least physically hold their own with the other characters in the show. Um, but again, one thing that I'm surprised, and I think a lot of tonight's episode will actually look at the material culture of Star Trek. Um, I'm surprised that they only have kind of that tonsure shield on the back of their head, and they don't actually have any greater ear protection. Like, even aesthetically, like, there's nothing that's designed about their ears, and they have very plain clothing. Um, ma- and their females typically go naked, but I don't know. I find the actual design of the Ferengi always fascinating because, on one hand, visually it's very neat and you can do a lot with it. But from a real storytelling and even a scientific perspective, there's a lot of things about it that make me wonder.
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Um, so Picard orders Riker to take shore leave on Beta Z, along with Deanna, while the Enterprise goes on to investigate a nebula. Um, Along the way, it is also mentioned that Wesley Crusher will soon be taking his oral exams for admission to Starfleet Academy, and the Enterprise will be meeting with, I think, um, the USS Bradbury, named, of course,
Yes,
after Ray
right,
Bradbury.
right.
But this will also introduce a storyline where Wesley is going to realize that Wesley realizes he's at the cusp of a big transition in his life, and that the outcomes of it are going to be very different from what he expected, especially after he has a conversation with Data and Geordi in engineering about the prospect of what happens to him after the academy. Wesley has the expectation that, of course, he would return to the Enterprise, but Data and Geordi are quick to remind him, I think, the reality of living as an officer or even as an enlisted crewman in Starfleet. You're probably going to be sent everywhere, and there's no guarantee that you're going to be with the people that you expected to be with, even if they're family members, like your mother, Beverly Crusher. Uh, what do you think of the Wesley storyline? Because we'll see later on how it concludes, but what do you think of the character, not only in this episode, but how he's been used up until now in season 3, and where they've been going with him?
I think you made a good comment. Is that it's sort of a somewhat evolutionary step for Wesley because you go back to the one, I guess it was in season one where the Traveler showed up,
Mm-hmm.
and the Traveler reveals to Wesley that he's something special, that he's something different, and we really don't understand where that's going to go. But throughout season two, and particularly in season three here, there's a lot of science fiction, scientific, physics related problems that come up. And
Mm-hmm.
Wesley, along with Geordi, or Wesley by himself, many times is the one that figures, who thinks outside the box
Quite
and
often,
says,
yes.
"Oh, this is how we address this problem. This, problem that could destroy the Enterprise or the entire crew and so on." So,
Well, may I make a note about something?
sure.
Data is important. Geordi is important because he has a by the book understanding of engineering and a kind of obsessive detail about the Enterprise that is important to have in a chief engineer. Data is able to use basically all the knowledge available in Starfleet to computate and come up with solutions in case of a real emergency. However, you're right, and you highlighted it very well. Wesley is there to really think outside the box in ways that Geordi and Data the android, who can do trillions of permutations per second in his positronic brain, a lot of the things that the Enterprise crew goes through, like you said in season two and season three, they wouldn't get out of without Wesley Crusher. So, I do think that I do want to highlight what you said, because I think it's very important to note in terms of character. Um, you know, he is an outside of the box character, and that outside of the box thing is manifesting some very special ways. But I'm sorry, continue. I interrupted.
Well, and that saving nature of Wesley shows up on this episode because when they're trying to figure out where the Ferengi, they figure out that the Ferengi, abducted Deanna, Laxwana, and Will. Um, Wesley's a key in helping them figure out, where they were in solving this problem again, and that ends up being the event that delays
Well,
him delays him from the
yes.
Bradbury. And it's interesting, it just kind of pulls him back because it sort of just demonstrates how Wesley really didn't think about how his life was changing, and maybe presented him with the idea that, am I ready to make this change at this time?
Mhm.
So the problem that he solves gives him the opportunity to hesitate, and it's going to be another year before he goes to Starfleet Academy.
Right. We're gonna have another season with him. Um, so I know you don't watch Star Trek Discovery. It's on Paramount Plus right now, and it just had its mid-season finale for its fourth season. There was a recent episode where Will Wheaton interviewed one of the stars, and he talked about how the character of Wesley Crusher was interesting for him because in many ways it mirrored something that was going on in his own life. Will Wheaton was raised by two very negligent and abusive parents who used his Hollywood stardom to kind of feed their own egos and pocketbooks. So they had these expectations of him being an actor that sometimes he didn't feel comfortable with. I think in many ways this episode is hinting at a discomfort that Wesley is starting to feel with not only the idea of changing, but the commitment to Starfleet Academy. It is very rigorous. It is very tough, and like Geordi and Data note in engineering, you suddenly stop being necessarily. Picard has afforded Wesley so much freedom aboard the Enterprise that he is able to exist in the command structure without actually being a part of the command structure. However, the moment he goes to Starfleet Academy, he is a full subordinate and he is not going to be given kind of the leeway that Picard has given him. And I think there's something in Wesley that is starting to question whether or not this is for him. I mean, he definitely wants to be a part of a team. He definitely wants to to contribute, but the idea of leaving his friends versus starting a career doing what they do, I think are two very different things. Um, so this, of course, circles back around to the storyline with Riker, Deanna, and uh, Luxana, where Riker takes shore leave on Beta Z, and we see him and Deanna both down on the planet, walking in these very lush gardens, which I know you and Mom lived in California for a little bit. Did you two live in Pasadena?
We know exactly where Huntington, yeah, Huntington,
Yeah, I
whatever.
was about to,
Yeah,
it's so that garden is the Huntington Library Botanical
yeah,
Gardens
yeah,
in
yeah. We live very close to it.
Pasadena.
Yeah,
It's also where they filmed Justice from the first season of Star Trek,
mm,
where
mhm.
they went down where Wesley falls into that flower bed, and
Yeah, that's right. That's
the
right.
god of the planet tries to execute him.
Right.
Have you actually been there?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
So, just from your experience, if you could recount for me and the listeners at home, what was it like?
Oh, it's a very lush garden. Pasadena is in the San Gabriel Valley,
Mm-hmm.
northeast of downtown Los Angeles. The San Gabriel Mountains are to the immediate north. They range anywhere from 6,000 to almost 10,000 feet high. Um, and Pasadena is a very nice area. Jet Propulsion Labs is there. We
Mm-hmm.
actually, the condo we rented when we lived there for a year back in the 80s was right across the street from Caltech. We used to
Oh,
walk, it
very neat.
walks onto the Caltech campus. The Huntington Library and so forth. There's a big hotel down there. Was probably about only less than 2 miles away.
Okay, very neat. I have to say, as a film setting, this is very beautiful and very lush, and it's one of the few times where I felt like, Star Trek uses Southern California, especially the areas around the studio, to film a lot. And of course, every planet at some point looks like Southern California.
Right. Yes.
But this is the first time where I think they used a garden very well to make Beta Z look very different from the other places they've gone.
Yes.
One thing that I found interesting about the garden and about Beta Z itself is a lot of the flora and fauna seem edible. In this garden, there was let me see if let me check my notes for the name of these berries.
Or the leaves or something like that. Yeah, exactly.
Yes, here let me. Mr. Home lays down for the picnic. I do have there is a production note here with oh yeah, the oscoid. So the oscoid looks like a piece of kale, or maybe something like a chard or something like that, like a Swiss chard or something like that. But it's very interesting that when Luxana details that, um, she notes how the sap is there to almost keep it warm, and when you bite into it, it has a warming taste. Um, Very interesting ecology of Beta Z that they have developed kind of these plants that take on these very interesting attributes. It makes me wonder if they're walking through this garden in Beta Z, um, that in a time that looks like either spring or summer. I wonder if their winters are so harsh that some of the plants, or maybe they have quick onset winters, that the plants have somehow developed a way to, I don't know, have warming chlorophyll that helps them endure something like
Well,
that.
the other thing to look at is they may not have any seasons at all. It may be
Oh, that's
a
true.
perpetual spring summer type thing.
Well, there are planets that we will come across in later episodes that do have like a weather control system, and it wouldn't surprise me in the future, in the 24th century, especially if you're a planet that seems as advanced and well placed in the Federation like the Betazoids are, that you wouldn't, that your planets wouldn't be climate controlled, so to speak. Um, in fact, one thing that I wanted to talk about when it came to the idea of climate control, there's an experiment apparently going on where they may release dust in the atmosphere
Yes,
to
right,
dim the sunlight coming through our
right.
ozone layer for a little bit, hopefully to help us decarbonize and move to green energy
Or
quicker.
is it just to block sunlight to slow down global warming? Is that it?
It's basically to slow down global warming.
And the other thing is, there's one movie that was out, and I've never run across it on Prime or anything, unless I had to buy it. I didn't want to do it. Is with Gerard Butler, Geostorm, and I
Oh
think
yeah,
that's something to do about some sort of climate control system that went awry
yes.
and caused all these problems. So the idea of a planet being able to uh, control its climate, is something to think about. I think there's probably research being done on that as to how we could, from orbit or from somewhere out in space, we could, reverse or treat some of the problems we're having with climate change now, global warming.
I wouldn't be surprised if that's what we end up having to do, and we make up a lot of mistakes along the way doing it. It seems like it's going to be very hard to convince other nations, including the U.S., to really take up carbon neutral and green technology. Not only because of the initial cost, which will be a lot, but also there has to be a real cultural change and a move away from like plastics, and that means a move away from petroleum by large, because we think that a lot of the petroleum that we process goes in the cars, but that's not true. It actually goes into the majority of it actually goes into our plastic goods. We would really have to have a dramatic change in our material lifestyle if we were to really make these changes. As it pertains to like a climate controlled system, I think on one hand it's a very interesting idea, but it's kind of up there with the idea of terraforming. Um, I think it would be something that we would eventually do in the future, but it would take a really long time to set up, and I think it would take a really long time to perfect. And if there were mistakes like that, I know you mentioned Geostorm by Gerard Butler, and I just remembered that film because I think I watched it a couple years ago. Um, if things were to go awry, and they do, there is a aspect to the Sub Rosa storyline in season 6 of Next Generation, which Beverly deals with the ghost that falls in love with her. But they're on this planet called New Caledonia, and the ghost is manipulating their climate control system and raising these horrific storms. If we had a climate control system that suddenly went awry, what does that look like? Do we suddenly have hurricanes or gale force winds? I think there's a lot of interesting questions, but also a lot of really interesting concerns as well. But another aspect of this that I wanted to examine, I've had this running theory that Troy and Riker are in a polyamorous relationship. And one of the reasons I think that is because of this right here. It's very clear that these two are still very close, still in the midst of a very intimate physical relationship. And it also seems like not only with Luxana's prodding for Troy to find a suitable husband so she can have children, provide Luxana grandchildren. Uh, it seems like there's always going to be this legitimate attraction between Will Riker and Deanna Troy, and this is just playing out here again. How do you think that we're near the end of season 3. We've had a good amount of time with these characters. They really never touch on the romance between Will Riker and Deanna Troy a lot, but when they do, it always seems to me to work out well, or there's good chemistry with it. How do you feel about the interaction between these two?
I guess that what the picture they painted of their relationship is that they're very good friends first, but beyond that,
Yes.
they do have this sexual attraction, a romantic relationship. But because of their uh, positions, their roles on the enterprise and so forth, they've decided that they don't need to be a matched pair. They don't need to be a couple. So,
Yes.
they give each other a certain degree of freedom because we see in various episodes where Will have sexual liaisons with these beautiful alien women on the planets he went to, and Deanna has had relationships with other men also.
Yeah, absolutely. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. I just had to stand up for a second.
Sure.
So, I think that the show has been quite bold in taking risks with these characters and the relationships they have without actually having to put names and labels to what these relationships are, which I think says something interesting about the culture of 1990 versus the culture of 2021, where, you and I think, would agree that now more than ever, categorization and labels seem to hold a lot more sway than they probably did in 1990. Even though I will say, I've been reading, in 1990, there was this kind of politically correct backlash to the culture taking place. And it seems interesting that even in 2021, we're having kind of a repeat of that. Um, can you give any reflection to that from a cultural standpoint of what I brought up? Like, things not being defined in 1990 kind of in the ways they are defined now. And I know that this is politically possibly a
Give me give give
sore
me
spot.
give me an example of the labeling you're talking about.
Okay, for example, we were just talking about the possibility of Will Riker and Deanna Troi being in a polyamorous relationship. The idea of polyamory wouldn't be discussed the way we're discussing it, I think, in 1990. Like, you're not sitting around dinner, I don't think you're sitting around the dinner table in other people's houses at dinner talking about polyamory. But that seems to be something that is, at least in my generation and younger, um, a topic of real like discussion. Uh, I think when it comes to things like politics, or there's just certain terms that we use now that I don't think you or the Gen X or older generations like you were using.
I'd make two comments. One, I think the practical example is in the 80s going into the 90s, there was much more awareness of homosexuality because of the HIV epidemic. And people, that caused that lifestyle to be openly discussed and so forth. So to the
Hmm.
point now, going back 10 years, you had certain states pass laws, even conservative states, that allowed, civil union, gay
Hmm.
marriage and so forth, whether it be two men or two women. And I think recent surveys indicate that the majority of the Americans, I don't know if it's 60%, 65 or whatever, they're accepting of same sex marriage now.
Hmm.
So you kind of had, but now we have different labels because there's all this discussion of trans and bi and cis and pronoun use
Right.
and all
That right
that.
there. That's what I'm talking about right
There
there.
was
I don't think you were talking about that in the 90s at
no,
all.
no, not at all. I mean, it's like once society got past the same sex marriage, that it's almost like, well, then we could delve further into the Q, the trans,
Yes.
all of that sort of thing. And the other comment is the big change is, of course, in terms of um, political speech and labels and so forth.
Hmm.
Yeah, there was label in the, it started I mean, there was still some sense of bipartisanship in the Congress, you know,
Right.
into the 90s. I think Gingrich kind of pushed it. I mean, there was already well-defined Democratic, principles and philosophy and platform versus Republican. Particularly coming out of Nixon into Ford and then into Carter and Reagan. And there was a good deal of bipartisanship, even in the Clinton administration, because Clinton and Newt Gingrich got some things done. But it was that, I see that as the point where the divide really started to happen. So we've gotten to the complete breakdown in any functionality in Congress now.
May I offer where I think, for me, the real breakdown happened?
Sure.
From a cultural basis.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people try to point to the Gore-Bush race of 2000 when things broke down. I disagree. I think there's two instances where Clinton failed to meet the Republicans in a way that mattered, and the Republicans used it to try, especially Gingrich, used it to trash Democrats. The first one was the Lewinsky scandal,
Right.
with Monica.
Right.
But that's because Bill got caught lying. There's no way to get around that. I think the second one, and this isn't Bill's fault, but the bombing of the USS Cole. I was just talking about this with someone. I think the bombing of the USS Cole was a moment for Republicans where they realized, well, this guy's willing to go into Serbia and Kosovo to fight for, Muslims in a different land, but when it comes to our armed services, and I've heard this argument before, when it comes to our armed services, Democrats aren't willing to put boots and blood on the ground to make sure that our men and women in uniform are safe, because the Cole bombing happened, and that was perpetrated by Al Qaeda as well, and we really had no measurable response that the public saw, at least on an international level. And I think for a lot of Republicans, that was a real cultural breaking point. I mean, the thing about, I think hindsight is hindsight and what it is, and I would like to ask you to comment this, and I have two more political questions before we get back to the show, because I have you here and we've never talked about this, so might as well. I think Clinton made a huge mistake compromising with Gingrich on welfare. I think Republicans got more out of that than Democrats got when it came to things like financial reform and prison and law enforcement reform. I think in many ways Republicans have taken the idea that we're willing to compromise, and since Gingrich have run it into a definition of something that's far more malignant and something that's not. I think government's supposed to be symbiotic. We're all supposed to work with each other. The liberal left side of the government is supposed to push forward progressive ideas and the idea that through governance we can better society, where you do need the traditional kind of conservative physical responsibility side to be like, hey, look,
So there's a
it's
balance.
important. Yeah, but I think with Gingrich, he took his compromise with Clinton and turned it from a symbiosis into a parasitic relationship.
Well, looking back on it, I think, because it's looked upon that there was some reforms in welfare that people had to meet certain criteria to get welfare. They had to try to get
Oh yeah,
jobs and so forth. I don't remember
drug
how
tests.
I don't remember how ambitious job creation programs were. But the thing is, if you look at where we are now, and it all started back then, it really started in the 80s under Reagan.
Mm-hmm.
If you wanted to solve some of these social problems that were related to um, economic fluency, ability to advance yourself economically, things in terms of the system weren't, things that needed to change in the system, the social system, didn't change. I mean, one of the
Mm-hmm.
things would be the minimum wage, getting people
Mm-hmm.
to
Yes,
have a minimum wage, get people having access to health care so that they could be
absolutely.
healthy and work and so on. So I think that's where that I have to tend to agree with you. I think that's where the compromise with the conservative side, with the Republican side, tamped down progressivism, progressive ideas that really needed to to advance.
Well, just so our conservative listeners who are hearing this don't think that we're picking on them, like
No,
the Clintons made a real big issue. Democrats under Clinton made a huge mistake by repealing Glass-Steagall, which allowed banks to combine their investment assets with their commercial banking assets, which has caused all sorts of problems. At the other side of that too, like the Southern Democrats under Clinton moved away from workers' rights and worker protections to a more neoliberal economic agenda, which depending on where you sit on the neoliberal agenda, it's either very good for you or very bad. But I think for most people now post COVID, it's starting to show itself as being very bad, just because it takes into account the bottom line, but it doesn't take into account the bottom of the human spirit, which in some ways we're heading if we're not careful. Um, two more things I wanted to ask you, and then I promise we'll get back to the episode. When it came to here in 2021, we have this huge cultural division between the left and the right. What was it like under Reagan? Like, was it like this or was it worse? I know a lot of people talk about 1968, and that's when Democrats really had a split in the party because there were the riots at the convention. But was there this political division under Reagan? Because people talk about him and Tip O'Neill and kind of this. I don't want to say golden age, but no, there's not this history of people being disagreeable in the 80s with Reagan, it
no,
seems.
no. I mean, there were people who did not like Ronald Reagan. There were people
Yeah.
who did not like Democrats, but I think that the majority who really detested or hated them was very small. Um, coming out of, um, it was, I think it was Spiro Agnew. I don't know if it was Spiro Agnew, whoever talked that it was a silent majority.
Hmm.
So like in 68, you had, that was when, the left wing, the Yippies, the Youth International Party and so forth was very relevant in that election, particularly at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. But
Hmm.
I think, again, it gets back to how much partisanship was there on the issues of the day back in the 80s. And it wasn't that bad. I mean, if you say, well, if you put it on a scale of how bad was the nonpartisanship, the conflict, it would be like maybe a 3 or a 3.5. As we're
Mm,
now, it's a 10. It's that bad.
right. Okay. So, okay. Well, then one more question off of that because you answered that so succinctly and well. Um, you were a teenager and in college during Vietnam. Was Vietnam worse? Like, were
Then
there like the political divisions now? Because there was a big anti-war movement that sprang out of Vietnam, and that's when you had the hippies and the flower power movement. You had a real kind of move within the culture to not only go against the establishment with counterculture, but also kind of challenge the idea that war was a acceptable response to almost anything.
it was very intense. I don't think it is bad as the division is now because um, some people may have thought that the government was going to fall, society was coming apart, but the basics of the government, of the Constitution, and so forth remained intact. As we're now, our whole governmental system and Constitution and the rule of law, democratic principles are really under threat. I mean, we're coming up on the first anniversary of January 6, 2021.
Eh, So, I didn't want to dig into that, but you brought it up, and I think it's important we make note. So, January 6th, 2021 is when supporters of the former president, Donald J. Trump, attempted a coup, or as some would say, because trying to report this fairly. Um, well, there's okay. I need to do away with that. There's no really reporting this fairly. hundreds of people tried to attempt a coup and threaten members of government by storming the Capitol building. And unfortunately, people were shot and many people were arrested. And we're still trying to figure out what happened that day. And as Dad just noted, we're coming up on the yearly anniversary of it. This is being recorded on the second day of 2022. Um, I just had an interview with someone for the Third Patrick book. I'm researching homeless veterans because Jesus has to rebuild his disciples um, once he comes to New York in the third book, and there's a huge homeless problem here in New York, but there's a real homeless veteran problem. So I was talking to someone who actually worked with homeless veterans here in New York to try to improve their situation, and because I want to represent these people properly, especially if I'm going to have them talk to Jesus. Um, I think so. One thing that we talked about was the culture of the military and how it kind of led to some of the systemic problems that you see that not only lead to homeless veterans, but also the radicalization of certain parts of that community. Because there were a lot of active duty military officers and enlisted service members at the January 6th attempted coup. Part of I think what's happened in at that event and since, um, and I think this actually goes back way before Reagan. I think this probably goes back to World War II, and this is just my view of it. And feel free to comment. Actually, please comment. Um, I think that we assumed after World War II, and especially after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of communism in Russia as we see it today, um, I think that there was this understanding that capitalism was going to be able to adapt to everything that came afterwards. And there's almost this um, and I think Eisenhower was the first one to point at it with the military industrial complex, but I think you have to point at it everywhere now. I don't think that there was a proper respect to how quickly technology would change. And it really didn't happen until the 90s with the internet, with things like AOL becoming commercially available to everyone, cell phones being, not only cheaply affordable finally, but also very reliable in terms of large coverage distances that start happening in the early 2000s. Um, I think in many ways, one of the reasons our democracy is at threat is threatened is because technology, just like economics, has outpaced a lot of those people that were at January 6th who I think voted for Trump out of economic concerns. Largely, there is a racial and malignant animus there, but there's also a long history of economic and social suffering.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think a lot of that came out of a lost group of people that is growing larger and larger by the day now, that have been displaced in large part by um, a overwhelming shift in technology that even today we are still grappling to um, move along with, let alone understand. We're at the, I don't know if you know what I'm talking about when I say Web 3, but we're on the cusp of something called Web 3, which is going to fundamentally change how all of us interact with the internet and how we do banking, how we order things online. It's really going to change how privacy works too. But no one knows about these things yet, and no one has even heard about Web 3 for the most part in the general zeitgeist of the culture because technology moves so quick now. People are still getting used to the idea of having a new iPhone every year, but we've had a new iPhone every year for 20 years now. I think in many ways the threat isn't just structural and internal in terms of the populace. I think the threat in many ways is an evolutionary one.
Oh, I totally agree. And another primary example is social media was created, but we haven't figured out the rules as to what how social media should really work.
Well, the hard part with that is that we do have examples of how it shouldn't work. Because, with the Facebook information dump, and I forget that brave young woman's name that testified in front of Congress, she should be remembered. She did something very heroic. We know that Facebook used their algorithm to manipulate people to be more politically toxic and caustic to each other. We know that they have supported not only Russian bots but conservative agencies trying to spread disinformation and misinformation, not only about the election but also of COVID. Um, at this point, I think the crazy thing about social media, at least for me, is that we know it's doing harm here, and we know exactly how it's doing harm. Now we know how the algorithms are. We don't. We may not know how the algorithms are being made, but we know what the results of the algorithms are. Um, at this point, to say that it shouldn't be regulated and that it can't be regulated is kind of a fallacy. Because it's like saying it's like it's like being the first soldiers to enter uh I think a concentration camp that went into World War II. You can't enter that concentration camp, look around and go and say what's going on here and not intrinsically know that there's something wrong
Hmm.
going on here.
Hmm.
And I think that that's the kind of the state that we're in now, even though I know some people at home listening to that will think, well, Jay, your analogy is very shocking. But I think the analogy fits because the moment we're in is very shocking, and this technology perceptually is shocking, and we're still working out the shock.
I think that's true. Yes.
But let's get back to the episode real quick. So, once they kidnap Riker, Troy, and Loxana, um, the Enterprise is off to investigate a nebula, and their communications are blocked. So it will be 2 days before they find out that the Ferengi and Damon Tog have abducted Riker and the um, the the Troi women. Sorry. Once they get up there, a bunch of different things happen. So Riker and Troy and Loxana are being held captive, and they are immediately beamed before. Well, Loxana and Troy are beamed out of their clothing to be presented nude before Damon Tog on the bridge of his ship, the Kraton. There with Doctor Ferrick, who offers to basically torture Loxana by probing her mind to find out the genetic factor that allows Beta Zeds to have telepathy. Luxana kind of reaches this immediate bargain with Damon Tog to save Deanna and save Riker by agreeing to become his mistress and essentially concubine. And they kind of consummate this in, I don't think that she has like intercourse with him. It's very clear that she gives him umox, which I think says something interesting about the Ferengi notion of sex. But it's also interesting because, on one hand, this is an episode where Luxana uses sex as a way to bargain. And I think it's a very interesting thing that it isn't dealt with as a very serious thing or a very weighty thing because this episode in itself is not very weighty. Like, it's supposed to be a
No.
fun, fast
Yeah.
episode. But if you look at this here, like from a 2021 perspective, it's very different now to watch it. I think than it was in the 1990s. I think it was probably a lot more fun and flirty in the 1990s and got more of a laugh. But looking at it now, it's a very interesting look into 24th century culture where, maybe sex is not seen as something that is lurid or taboo, and, people are much more open with their sexual relations to where, maybe there is a future where sex is somewhat of a commodity that you can trade. But there's still this kind of moment of disgust and resentment and um, what's reluctance by Luxana to take part in a physical relationship with Damon Togg. And I just find like this scene right here is very odd and very interesting to me. And do you have any thoughts on it?
Um, yeah, I think I, th- I think when they sat on Damon Todd's bed, it was like, oh, are they going to have intercourse? And they kind of stopped
Mm-hmm.
short right there. And then the whole idea of sexual gratification or stimulation by the umaks on the ears
Mm-hmm.
comes in. And they do
Which is a
kiss.
clever way to get through.
Yeah. And they do kiss at one point. So it was, I think that they kind of handled it in a interesting manner because they were
Mm-hmm.
dealing with Ferengi who had a very different, unique erogenous zone.
And I think it's, as uncomfortable as it may be, I think it is, as you said, handled very well. Interesting thing that should be noted. So, since Michelle Barrett was starring in this episode, Gene Roddenberry not only helped write this episode, but he was on the set all the time, and he was actually very supportive and very helpful to the entire crew during this episode. And even though, like, people thought some parts of this originally, the oscoid, the thing that Riker eats, is supposed to have much more of a phallic shape to it. They wrote that out because they were like, "We're not doing this, Gene."
Right,
He
right.
was like, "Damn," but I think this episode handles Michelle Barrett very well and really plays to a lot of her strengths. So while Michelle Barrett is dealing with Damon Togg, Riker uses 3D chess with one of the other Ferengi. I can't remember his name right now,
Yeah,
but one of the other Ferengi to basically finagle his way out of his cell and get a signal out to the Enterprise using the I'm going to. I think they're Angolan. No, not Angolan. Angola's a real thing. No, Angolian music.
that's
He
right. That's
uses
right.
a melody from the Angolian music chimes at the beginning of the episode to send
Yes.
out basically a sonar signal that he hopes the Enterprise will pick up. And thankfully, because they have Wesley Crusher there, who has apparently the best ear in the galaxy, they're able to pick it up and actually locate the Kraton. So this leads to where we will end the episode, but also a really fantastic scene that helps form part of the basis of the theme song you're all listening to at the beginning of every episode for Where No Bubs Has Gone Before. Um, Picard and Data by the illustrious Pogo, our friend in Australia. Um, Shout out to him. I hope he's listening and enjoying what he hears. Um, what more can be said about the scene other than how brilliant it is? Patrick Stewart is amazing, and I was wondering if you had any particular um, reflections of the scene, or
I just thought that since we know that Patrick Stewart has a Shakespearean background, that it must have been an opportunity for him to have great fun with that scene.
well, some of these lines are just
Yes,
some of the best backhanded things. Like, um, for example, he uses the line from so he has to convince Tog that he is a jilted former lover of Loxana's who cannot bear to see her in the arms of another man, let alone a Ferengi. So he is going to either get her back or destroy Tog and the Kraken, and even Loxana trying. And some of the lines that he pulls out to kind of convey the truth of what he's saying here not only speaks to the brilliance of Captain Jean-Luc Picard, played by the brilliant Patrick Stewart, but I want to take a moment and highlight Shakespeare for a second, because we've seen Shakespeare in the show before, and the Bard is, of course, all deserving of every ounce of praise that we can give him. I, I like you, Dad, probably consider him truly one of the great writers of history, and deservingly so. I can't think of a single person that cannot think of a play or sonnet out of Shakespeare that they do not like. The man is a writer's writer. If he wrote the plays he wrote, because there's all these famous mysteries. But one of the most beautiful lines is from Shakespeare's Sonnet 141. In faith, I do not love thee with mine eyes, for they in thee a thousand errors see. But 'tis my heart that loves what they despise, who in despite of a view is pleased to date. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Love is not love which alters which alteration finds, or bends with the remover to remove. And it's if you just listen to these lines that are taken from Sonnet 141, Sonnet 18, Sonnet 116, um, they're both these beautiful compliments, but they're also these kind of backhanded exchanges to the lover of like, yeah, I love you, but you're not that great. Which kind of mimics the relationship between Luxana and Picard very well. Her always chasing him and him reluctantly having to put up with her. Of course, we have the famous the two famous lines. The first one from Othello, Act 4, Scene 2. When I have plucked the rose, I cannot give it vital growth again. It needs must wither. Um, 'Tis better to have loved and lost than to never have loved at all. But a lot of people mistake that last line actually for Shakespeare, but it's not Shakespeare. It's Alfred Tennyson's. It's from Alfred Tennyson's Immor- Immorarium AHH Canto 27, which I forget what the AHH stands for, but just these kind of like beautifully delivered lines in this language that is both layered and faceted. Um, I can't think of a more charming scene that I've watched this season or any season so far in Star Trek. It's probably one of my favorite moments because it. I think everyone is just happy to be in that scene, and everyone is just enjoying there. And I think you see the actors enjoying it. Um, this is our last scene to talk about here tonight before we get to what happens with Wesley Crusher. Before we move on, do you have any final thoughts on this play on the bridge that we get to see?
No, I just think, as you said, it's great fun.
Absolutely. So the episode ends with Captain Picard calling Wesley Crusher into his office because Wesley Crusher missed his ride out on the Bradbury, and um, Captain Picard has been in communication with Starfleet and understanding Wesley's contribution to helping rescue Luxana Troi, Commander Riker, and Counselor Troi. Uh, he, Picard has noted that Wesley, for the most part, has only been an acting ensign in name. That while he has been given privileges to serve on the bridge and help with the crew, he is not in himself an actual officer. Picard finally rewards him with a field commission as an acting ensign, or as a full ensign within Starfleet, with the idea that he will still go on to the academy in the year. But um, I think this is a very touching scene, and I think it's important because it establishes that of all the people to value Wesley on the crew, it's very important that he has this father figure that is not only connected to Jack Crusher, but can kind of continue the legacies and do the things that Jack Crusher couldn't do, and some of the things that Beverly can't do. Even though Beverly gets to be there at the end to see Wesley, walk onto the bridge finally in the uniform for the first time, which Will Wheaton looked great in. Um, I just think that it's a really wonderful scene, and I think that this is one of those places where it shows what good leadership looks like. Like good leadership really does reward good performance and good behavior, but more importantly, I think good people.
Yes.
Picard values Wesley not only for his ability to get things done, but his honest caring that he shows to his other crew members. Like this is a young man who is well beyond his years and already, he by all rights deserves to be on the flagship of the
Yes.
fastest ship in the fleet.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
What do you think of the field commission, though?
Oh, I think it's just what we said before. Just it's part of the whole maturation and growth of Wesley Crusher toward what he ultimately becomes. And as you said, it really demonstrates that Picard was reluctant to have Wesley even come on the bridge in season one,
Mm-hmm.
but then he develops he almost becomes a surrogate father without realizing,
Absolutely.
as you said, it maintains since Picard has a strong relationship with his mother, and they knew each other. Picard and Jack Crusher and Beverly knew each other when they were young officers and so forth. It's just a good continuity of the relationship, and as you said, um, Picard and many members of the crew, Data, Riker, Worf,
Mm-hmm.
they all nurtured him into the person that the young man that he is.
And you know what? I think that you summed that up very well because the very last shot, right before they head off to the next adventure, is Wesley at the helm, but then of course you have the entire family there.
The family, that's the key. Yeah,
Yeah. Um,
that's it.
One thing that I want to mention before we go, because I think we've had a great episode. Um, right after his character's promotion on the show, Gene Roddenberry actually gave Will Wheaton the second lieutenant bars he earned in the Army Air Corps, um, which the second lieutenant is being the equivalent to an ensign in the U.S. Navy. Here's a fun fact. Not only is that very touching for Gene Roddenberry, an actual war hero and combat pilot, to do for a young man in Will Wheaton. Guess who was present for the ceremony? Take a wild guess.
The ceremony
1990.
when
No,
Rod when
when
Roddenberry gave
Roddenberry
his.
gave his second lieutenant bars to Will Wheaton.
Oh, gee, my.
It's going to be kind of out of left field. I'll give you a hint. A general military famous in 1990, like a big name for a general in 1990.
1990. Colin Powell.
Yes, Colin Powell was there for the
Wow,
event.
wow,
There's even
cool.
an event on Memory Alpha. I'll actually post it tonight
Yeah,
on
good.
Facebook for you to see. But
Okay.
Colin Powell was there to watch Gene Roddenberry give his bars to Will Wheaton.
Wow, that's neat. That's neat to know.
Yeah, isn't that a very interesting
It
fact?
sure is. Yes,
Yeah, but Dad, I think that this is a great episode. It's just a fun episode,
it
even this
is.
late in the season.
Yeah.
Um, any final thoughts?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well.
Okay, well, everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This has been a really great discussion. We are getting very, very close to the end of season 3. Our next episode is Star Trek season 3, episode 25, Transfigurations, which is another favorite of mine. I actually think that we're going to have a very in depth episode, but that's for next time. Until then, everyone, night, Dad.
Good night, Jay. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye bye.